reflective lenses, so
Right.
my screen goes quite visible through my glasses. It's
Yeah, well, I get these glasses and they're sort of big and bulky, but I buy my glasses on eBay for $1.80, so I buy them
Oh,
in bulk.
really? Wait, does that come with the lenses?
Yeah, that comes with the lenses, but they're also reflective. So if I don't have to read, I can take them off.
I got mine from Zinni Optical for like, I think it was $35 but it came with like the attachable sun visor thingies, which are really
Okay.
nice.
Yeah.
Where do you get them on eBay for $1? I want to find this. This is good.
Yeah. You just look. Well, you see, I mean, they're not prescription. They're just
Oh,
for
gotcha.
Old people who need magnifiers.
Gotcha.
So they're just magnifiers. They're not prescription. Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah, because I got mine. The cheapest ones I found for prescription are Zinni Optical and some other websites, which are like $30 ish for all the
Mm-hmm.
basic stuff, as opposed to like Oakley, which is like $400 for no reason.
Yeah. Right.
$10 glasses.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
All right. Well, it looks like we are live. There is some people in the audience. So, Chris, thanks for coming on. Appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure thing. So my name is Chris. I'm a ex-engineer. I used to teach engineering. Then I got into philosophy of science. I've been a Christian since my late teens. And I've always been interested in the relationship between science and Christian faith. I took a few years off to be a missionary in Argentina for 13 years with my family, 5 sons and a wife. Excuse me. Came back to Australia, did a PhD in something called philosophical hermeneutics, but roughly science and faith. And I teach philosophy 2 days a week. But my main role now is to run an organisation, a small Christian not-for-profit called Christians in Science. Well, we call it Christians in Science sometimes. It's called ISCAST, and our aim is to promote a constructive conversation between science and faith. Shall I tell you a bit more about what ISCAST does?
Sure.
So we do everything from the academic end. We have an academic journal. To the other end, this week we spoke to 1,200 students in a school, spent 20 hours with the whole secondary cohort in a school. We took scientists in to talk about evolution and biology and creation care and all that sort of thing, and to talk about the relationship between their faith and their science. So and as you can tell from my accent, I'm Australian. ISCAST is an Australian organisation, although my first few years were spent in the south of Canada on the Great Lakes. So I'm Canadian-Australian.
I am in Minnesota, so I'm also connected to the Great Lakes.
Not too far away from Picton, Ontario.
Sure. So I'm an atheist. I believe that all of the particular evidence and arguments that are presented for the evidence of God can be better or equivalently used to justify a naturalist hypothesis. So, for example, say a cosmological argument, everything that begins to exist has a cause, the universe has a cause. Or everything that begins to exist has a cause, the universe began to exist, the universe has a cause. That could be equally explained by a God as it could be a quantum field or any of the models in physics. And I think that simply looking at the argument on its own, it doesn't seem to give us a reason to prioritize one of those explanations over another. And so we would need some kind of a symmetry breaker to indicate one hypothesis over the other, theism over naturalism, or vice versa. And I think if we go through every single one of the arguments for the existence of God, all of them seem to be able to be equivalently matched one way or the other to both of them. But I think there are symmetry breakers. For example, like there's lots of evidence of the natural world. And so positing something like a quantum field that could cause the universe seems to have more evidential support than positing something which is made of parts which have not been verified. So like quantum fields, all the parts have been verified. I think the current model is that The quantum fields are a combination of vacuum states and the energy states of the universe, which were confirmed by like the Casimir effect, and then early universe inflation, which was Guth's early universe inflation, which made successful predictions. So both of those have a very good basis in evidence. But things like all powerful, all knowing, all loving mind outside of space time, those things have not been confirmed by evidence. And so if we're trying to find out which is the better explanation of, say, the origin of the universe, it would be similar to asking or seeing like a hoof print in the snow and saying, comparing two hypotheses. One was that a horse did it. One was that a unicorn did it. Horses are made of all parts that have been confirmed to exist. And so a horse would be a better explanation than a unicorn because it can explain the data. And the reason it's better is because all of the parts of the hypothesis have been confirmed to exist empirically. And that seems to lean credence towards that hypothesis as opposed to like a unicorn or something that has magical properties. And I think the same thing would apply to a naturalist hypothesis when comparing it to a God hypothesis.
And I take it from the silence you'd like me to respond to that.
Sure. I just want to give you a chance to speak, thoughts, whatever.
Sure thing. Okay, just some thoughts. I guess listening to you, Tom, it sounds like you're pretty committed to a naturalist, to preferencing a naturalist sort of position when you talk about evidence and empiricism. And now, of course, I mean, coming from where I'm coming from, I'm absolutely committed to mainstream science. But I guess in terms of symmetry breakers, what I'd say is it's quite clear that mainstream science has its limits and either can't explain or can't answer all the questions that human beings have, or answers those questions by saying, well, they're not really valid questions, they're pseudo questions. And those sort of questions, I guess, you can think of moral questions or philosophical questions, or probably in our lives, my guess is that for most people, it's the existential questions that challenge us, and we say, what's going on here? I mean, just this week, as I said, we spoke to 1,200 students in a school this week, and I shared with them a personal story. I said to them, it was a boys' school, so I said to them, "Hey guys, some of you know what I'm talking about when I talk about existential questions, but some of you probably don't yet." And I shared the story of our own family, and I said, we had a 23-year-old son who was about to do medicine, just finishing science, and came home from the doctor one day, lump on his leg, said jokingly, half jokingly, "Oh, the doctor says I might have cancer." And Ben died 5 months later. Actually, by coincidence, you can see Ben in the background there. Ben died 5 months later of cancer. And I said, when these existential questions come, you either need, if you think there are answers to the questions of the purpose of life, ultimate purpose of life, not just self-created purpose of life, or is there a God, or is there meaning, you either need a framework within which science finds its place, or you say, well, no, the only answers are scientific answers in terms of chemicals, molecules, biology, the historical story of biology, life on Earth. Or you need a framework that says, that can provide answers that say, well, there are answers, even if we're not clear on those answers. Now, I'm not suggesting that Christians or any other religious people have sort of nailed it totally. But I guess Christians, I speak as a Christian, but I recognize a lot of what I say would go for other religious people. Christians, religious people in general, would say there is a framework. Those are not nonsensical questions. There is a moral framework to the universe. There is to go back to a philosophical question. I mean, science can't justify its own presuppositions, and yet we hold on to them very clearly. We believe that we're in touch with the real world, not in a simulation or a matrix, or subjected to Descartes' demon. Depending on how old you are, you might not know Descartes' demon. You might not even know the matrix, but you do know what artificial reality is. Are we living in artificial reality, or is science actually getting hold of the universe? Now, I can't speak for you, Tom, but guessing on what you said before, you would probably say that science is grasping the universe. Human beings do have an ability to recognise truth about the universe we live in with respect to the natural world. So there's my first sort of response. The other thing I'd say is what sorts of evidence are we looking for? If we constrain the word evidence to what we understand by evidence in the natural sciences, and of course the natural sciences, if we're talking about the natural sciences or sciences more broadly, the sciences have different sorts of evidence depending on what sort of science you're looking at. And is history science? Well, we have evidence in history. And in the last 10 minutes, we've had what the law courts call proof beyond reasonable doubt. Your ex-president has been found guilty beyond reasonable doubt of certain crimes. Now, I imagine he will tell us that he is innocent and that it's been a travesty of justice. And he will play on the point that you can't prove these things. Now, he might not give us the philosophical response that, you can't prove anything. But the fact is, ultimately, we can't prove anything. We need to run with what we believe is beyond reasonable doubt. And beyond reasonable doubt carries different weight depending on how important the claims are. But I better stop talking. I've said a lot.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. And so there's a number of points there I hear quite often that I'm interested in discussing more. So like the first thing is science having limits. Like obviously I agree science has limits, but that doesn't seem to tell us anything, because to say like a ruler is 1 foot long, so it can't measure anything longer than a foot or something along those lines. Even if we have an object that we know is longer than a foot, you couldn't therefore say, well, my leprechaun friend can measure this object, because we don't have access to this leprechaun friend. It's just we only have the ruler. And so if the ruler is unable to measure it, until we have another tool that can be demonstrated to be as accurate or successful as the ruler, it seems like making a guesstimation based off of the ruler is a more reliable methodology than to posit a new tool that hasn't been discovered and hasn't been demonstrated to work yet, that may or may not be able to measure this rock. And so to posit one alternative possible tool that may be able to do this doesn't seem any more justified than anybody else just making up any tool that they can imagine that could potentially measure the rock. Because until we have some way to differentiate imagination from reality, it doesn't seem like the fact that one tool can't do something would ever be evidence for any other tools either existing or being able to do the thing. And so while I agree science has limits, until another tool is found that is as successful as science at differentiating imagination from reality, then it still seems like using science and trying to make the best guesstimation possible is a more rational approach. You mentioned like history. So I grant history is science. I'm perfectly happy to grant history is science. See what were the other things? There are questions that science doesn't answer, like existential questions. Like I agree, this would be like the rock that's too big for science to measure. And so you can create a worldview, as you mentioned, that can give you a framework to answer these questions, like a hypothetical God or many gods, and say there's an afterlife. But for me, this goes back to the part of saying, well, any one tool you make up would be just as good as any other tool that anybody else makes up. So just as you can posit an afterlife that is supernatural. You could posit an afterlife that's purely natural. Like you could say, maybe there's some force of nature we haven't discovered yet that retains your patterns of consciousness. And when you die, those patterns of consciousness can be ingrained on the universe and you go to an afterlife. So you can have an afterlife and a soul and all of the things that are typically associated with the supernatural realm in a purely materialistic way. And even though we've never discovered any evidence of that, we also haven't discovered any evidence of the spiritual side, as far as I can tell. And so both would be equally as plausible to explain the data, and neither would have a supporting basis of evidence. And so they'd both be able to equally provide answers to the existential questions. So just as you can have a religious basis that can answer these existential questions, you could make up a naturalist religion to also provide answers to the existential questions that are equally as justified, as far as I can tell. And so I don't see the symmetry breaker in that case of the existential questions of why couldn't a naturalist hypothesis provide those answers in the same way that a religious hypothesis would. And then you mentioned the presuppositions of science, like that we are in the natural world or whatever, the uniformity of nature, laws of logic, et cetera, et cetera. I agree that there are many things that we can presuppose for logic and math and reality and all of those core features of the fundamental nature of reality. But I don't see why a God would be able to justify those any better. Because, for example, saying that we exist in a world that isn't in the Matrix or isn't in Descartes' demon, the same problem exists in a God based worldview, because Descartes' demon could have fooled you into thinking that you believe in a God that's perfectly good, but it's really just Descartes' demon messing with your mind. And all of the things that you experienced in your life that could have been very transformative religious experiences could also just have been Descartes' demon messing with your mind.
Mhm.
And so, just as Descartes' demon could make the physical world be a misapprehension that we've perceived based off of our hypotheses, he could also make the spiritual world be a misapprehension in the exact same ways. Same with logic and math. Logic and math could be lies that the demon told us and we were all created 5 seconds ago or whatever. And so it seems like both worldviews have the same problem in that there's always going to be presuppositions that are unjustifiable because there's always going to be outs of where this could be wrong, with one exception also coming from Descartes: cogito ergo sum. I can't believe I exist and be wrong. That part you can know. That one's good. But other than that, it seems like the same presuppositions that exist in science that you have to presuppose would also have to be presupposed under the God hypothesis. Even if you believe or say that God has a reason to make these things true consistently over time, you could just say the same thing about science. Say there's some undiscovered law that
Mhm.
makes the laws of logic true or that makes the uniformity of nature consistent. But those are secondary. Those could just be false. It could be a product of Descartes' demon. And so all of these secondary facts, like the nature of God or the nature of the universe and the possible constraints they could have in order to make the universe the way that we want it to support our presuppositions, would all be secondary and could all be lies produced by Descartes' demon or something along those lines. And so I would again see in that question there's a parity between the naturalist hypothesis and the supernaturalist hypothesis. And then before I turn it back to you, you mentioned sorts of evidence. I think all evidence can be categorized as one thing, that which differentiates imagination from reality. If it can indicate or increase the probability that your proposition corresponds to reality more than your imagination, that's evidence. That's all evidence is for me in every field.
Oh, I'm not going to let you get away with that one. No, 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 no. That last claim is a circular argument.
How so?
Evidence is that which differentiates reality from imagination. Is that what you said? Okay.
Yes.
If that's the claim, that assumes that we know the difference between reality and imagination before we look at evidence. Otherwise, in other words, evidence is dependent on already knowing the difference between imagination and reality, isn't it? Or I might have missed the claim.
No, that's totally fine. So my epistemology starts with the cogito. I think therefore I am. And there's some difference between my imagination and my experiences. So like if I imagine unicorn, I don't
Yep.
see a unicorn. There's a difference there. And I need some kind of methodology to differentiate between the two. And so the best way that seems to do that is novel predictions. So I can say if the thing I'm seeing is a part of my imagination, I will not be able to touch it. but if it is a part of the perceived external world, I will be able to touch it. I go over, I touch it, like, okay, that's a good reason to think it's not purely a figment of my imagination. Now it's my imagination plus the experiential world. Whether or not that's real isn't a part of the argument here. All that I need to do is show that if it's a part of the experiential world, whether or not that's real, I'm going to call that reality, and I can have some method to show it's a part of at least the experiential world plus the imagination, as opposed to being just a part of the imagination. And that's what I would call evidence. So if you can show that it's not just a part of your imagination, it's more at least a part of the experiential world, that's what I would count as evidence. Whether or not the experiential world is like Descartes' demon or something would be a separate line of evidence.
Yeah, right. Okay. It seems to me that you're still holding on to a commitment to a claim something like evidence equals the sort of evidence we find in science. In other words, a claim something like naturalism is the only rational way to think, and other sorts of evidence are ruled out. And that's fine to hold on to that claim, but I guess some of our discussion is about what claims you can make strongly and what are the underlying presuppositions from which you make those claims. But let me go back a step. I agree with you that if what you're saying implicitly is we ought not to believe things for which we don't have evidence. What I'm disagreeing with you about is the different sorts of evidence that can be allowed. So I agree with you completely that you don't just sort of speculate about celestial teapots and unicorns and think, well, I can conceive of that idea and it suits me today to believe that they're true. That's not serious thinking. So obviously I want to make the claim that you can be a Christian and a serious thinker, and therefore I am bound to make the claim by my own commitments, which I've just explained. I'm bound to make the claim that I have some sort of evidence, I have some sort of reasons to believe. Now, I'm not one of those Christians who thinks that if only you just looked at Aquinas' 5 ways, you would therefore automatically, as soon as you looked very clearly at it, you would automatically believe in God. But I don't think Aquinas wrote his 5 ways, even though they're commonly called proofs for the existence of God. The word proof has gone through a lot of machinations in the English language, and as we know, proof, you can quote prove a metal, which means test. Now, testing is not the same as the idea of proof that arises out of Descartes' quest, where he was looking for indubitable proof. So I think that evidence is a good thing, whatever field you're looking at. And we're also, I think, I'm just trying to lay out some of the what we're talking about here. I think it's also clear that we're also talking about truth. When I make a claim about there being a God, I think you and I are in agreement that we both can't be right. That we're in agreement that we're not going down some extreme postmodern relativist line where you're right, Tom, you're completely right, and I'm also right, and you say there is no God, and I say there is a God, and we're both right. So we're not going down that line. So back to evidence. I can hear the naturalist line that, well, what sort of evidence could there be that isn't the sort of evidence we expect in science?
Well,
Um,
may I cut in there for a
yeah,
moment?
yeah,
Because
sure, feel free.
I think you interpreted my statement to be a little stronger than what it is. Because
Okay,
my
sure.
statement is that not specifically that science or naturalism is the correct approach. I think those are conclusions, but not starting points. So I think
Mm,
that evidence is anything that can differentiate imagination from reality. Because I think anybody can come up with a million ideas. And the question is that truth claim that you mentioned, truth is that which corresponds to reality. And so you need some way to increase the probability that your hypothesis in your imagination is true, does correspond to reality. And so I'm open to any way that can do that. Doesn't matter if
mm,
it's natural, supernatural, philosophical, any way, I'm totally fine with that. And I, of course, I think that science is just a method that adopts any way that does that. So if it doesn't start with being only the scientific method, it's any method that you can show can do that will become science. And so I'm happy to admit any evidence that you can provide that can differentiate imagination from reality. I will gladly accept that as evidence. Whether or not it's natural makes no difference to me whatsoever. And so I would be, as far as I'm aware, the only ways that do that are scientific. I don't know of
yeah,
any
sure.
ways that can do that aren't
Sure.
scientific. And so if you have
Sure.
any, please let me know. That would be great.
Okay. Yeah, sure. I still think that you're begging the question, offering a circular argument if you say evidence is that which differentiates between uh, reality and imagination, unless you're willing to say, well, it's a sort of iterative process. It's a testing process, and ultimately, while we never arrive at that final proof, while we never arrive at absolute confidence, um, we stake our claim and say, for example, I will stake my claim and say that I'm not talking to an AI now, um, despite the advances in AI in the last in the last 2 or 3 years, and despite the fact that AIs can pass the Turing test. I don't think you are an AI passing the Turing test. I think you're a real person on the other side of the world. It is quite amazing, but I'm absolutely convinced of that. I cannot prove that, and in a speculative hypothesis, you could be an AI having a conversation with me. More advanced than I've seen yet, but give us another year and we'll see how we go. So we never have that absolute proof. And those who want to rest on some sort of absolute proof confidence haven't done enough philosophy, haven't done enough hard thinking. I mean, philosophy is just another word for hard thinking, critical thinking. I don't think they've thought hard enough about Cartesian possibilities and all the rest of it. So evidence. Why? I guess the nub of this whole thing is, come on, Chris, you're a Christian. You're talking about evidence, but you haven't offered any evidence. You've said you don't believe in unicorns and celestial teapots, and more than that, implicitly you've said you don't believe in Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism. You've said you're a Christian. How so? What's the evidence? Well, I guess if I have to respond, and I'm very conscious that I'm sort of responding within the naturalist framework, but if I have to respond in that way, um, the obvious starting point is historical evidence. Historians, there's no disagreement that Jesus existed. Anybody who wants to say Jesus didn't exist is going against the whole mainstream of history. And I'm not talking about religious history. I'm talking about atheist historians as well. So can we put aside whether or not Jesus existed? Do you
Oh
think?
yeah, absolutely.
Can
I'm
I
not a
move on from
mythicist.
there?
I'm not
Okay.
a Richard Carrier fan.
Okay.
Absolutely agree.
Okay. So moving on from there, extraordinary claims, and you and your friends will say extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence. What sort of evidence can you expect if Jesus was not just a normal man? Let's nail it specifically. What sort of evidence can you expect if Jesus rose from the dead after 3 days, which is Orthodox Christian belief? Now, I don't claim to be a Christian simply because of historical evidence, and I think the historical evidence says Jesus rose from the dead, but that's still a valid line of thinking. And of course, C.S. Lewis was, the Narnia man was famous in saying, what do we make of the claims of Jesus? Now, whether or not we believe the four Gospels as some sort of roughly accurate record of the life of Jesus is a big question. But of course, the four Gospels, of the literature, of the things written at the time, the four Gospels are by far the most confirmed. So I would also say, along with many atheist historians, textual people, we have very strong evidence of what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or whoever the authors were, of what they wrote approximately 1900 years ago. So we have these records, more strongly affirmed than other things at the time. So then the question is what we make of those records, and what do we make of the early history of the Christian church, where being a Christian was quite out of vogue and got you crucified upside down or some other gruesome form of dying. We have these records. Why did people believe the things they did? Was this a case of mass hallucination, etc., etc., etc.? Now comes the problem, and the problem is the problem of miracles, because the question is, what are we open to believing? Because if we're not open to believing that we live in a natural world governed by order, but there is no absolute reason why that order can't be broken if there were a supernatural being. If we're open to considering that possibility, then we become open to considering the possibility that the historical records we've got are not only roughly true about the, if you like, the natural life of Jesus, but might also be pointing to something way beyond what we can understand with our natural glasses on. And then we have to weigh that up. And, I mentioned C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis said the option that we do not have is that Jesus was a good person, just a good person. He said the three options that we have are: he was mad, he thought he was the Messiah, he thought he was God incarnate, and he made very weird claims about himself. In other words, he was mad. What are the other ones? The one option is the he was the Messiah. He was sent by God, and we get into theological complexity here, but just call him God in the flesh, which is pretty standard Christian talk. So either he was mad, or he was God in the flesh, and whatever the third option that Lewis gives us. But Lewis says, he can't be a good teacher because he was lying. Yeah, well, the other one is the liar. He knew he wasn't, but it suited him for some reason or other to go around deceiving people. And those people were so deceived that they laid their lives on the line. They wrote stories about all the witnesses to the resurrection. Those people were so deceived that they even wrote extraordinary stories about women being the first witnesses to the resurrection in a time when women were not counted as valid witnesses to anything. How do you explain this? Now going back to a sort of scientific way of thinking, we are looking for the inference to the best explanation. What is the best explanation of the gospel records? Now, I don't think that it's a sort of lay down misère that the gospel records are obviously the true records, that it's quite obvious Jesus he couldn't have been a liar, he couldn't have been mad. Maybe he was mad, maybe he was a liar, but I do tend to agree that those are your three options, and the good teacher option is doesn't quite fit with either being mad or a liar. So that's one line of evidence, and that's the sort of the most naturalistic line of evidence, if you like, the most scientific line of evidence. Other lines of evidence are obviously religious experience. How does one compare the experience of somebody who says, I have never had a transcendental experience in my life, to the experience of somebody who goes up on a high mountain and looks at the view and says, wow, awe, wonder, there's something more than science. I don't know what it is, but I just know there's more. I had one of them. This is a sort of excursus, but I spent 2 weeks in the southwest of Tasmania recently. It's a wilderness area where you can't get mobile phone reception. So I was cut off from the world for 2 weeks. It was brilliant. But anyway, that's just beside the point. How does one compare the experience of the person who says, no, I just don't get it. I have had no transcendental experiences. I don't think there's a sort of moral framework to the universe. And how does one compare that to the Christian? And then, you can add the Hindu and the Buddhist and all the rest, who say, I have had experiences that I can only interpret this way. Now, agreed, we can't all be right. If the way I interpret it is there is a God who loves me, and the way that somebody else interprets all their package of evidence to say there is no God who loves us. But the question is, how do you interpret religious evidence, religious experience? That's another line of evidence that some people say is strong evidence, and many Christians around the world would, let me say, unfortunately, coming from my perspective, unfortunately, probably that's their only line of evidence. I believe in God because I experience God. I'd want to push back and say, well, hey guys, experiences, you experience things on LSD too. And, how do you weigh up your experiences? So there's another line of evidence, I guess. Then another line of evidence is the bigger picture of the inference to the best explanation. The best explanation of the moral sense is, and I know that you've thought about this a lot, so I'm waiting for the double punch in return. So I better just keep talking and not give you a chance to interrupt, Tom. The moral sense, I mean, let's just assume that you and I, and maybe the people who are listening, have an agreement that torturing the innocent is wrong. And at a superficial level, we'll all say, yes, torturing the innocent is wrong. Question, why do we say that? Now, the naturalistic explanation of that, which is quite plausible, I'm not saying it's not plausible. In fact, more than that, I think it's true, because I claim that evolution, the whole evolutionary story, I claim that is true, but that there can be more than one cause. So the naturalistic explanation of that moral sense that torture is wrong, torturing the innocent is wrong, is that evolution has produced in us this belief that torturing the innocent is wrong. And that is completely plausible, and I go along with it. But the problem is, if you say the evolutionary process has produced in us the belief that torturing the innocent is wrong, you can still ask the question, is that belief a true belief? And you can either say, yes, it's a true belief, above and beyond the evolutionary process that's conditioned us to believe it, or you can say, you probably won't say it's a false belief, you'll just say it's a nonsensical belief, because it's a belief in something above and beyond the evolutionary process. It's making a claim about something that science can't lay hold of. But you might push back and say, no, you've misunderstood the way naturalists understand morality. Back to you.
So I would agree that that is exactly how naturalists understand morality. And I would agree that if you think that evolution is the ultimate arbiter of our moral beliefs, then you believe in subjective morality. It's not objective. But I agree with what you said earlier that even if we agree that morality is how morality has been, im- if evolution is how morality has been imparted onto us, that doesn't mean you can't say morality has some further basis that does objectively exist to which those beliefs can correspond. So it can still be true. So like it could be a god, a platonic object, a priori abstract, law of physics. There's lots of options that could ground morality and then affect evolution to give us the beliefs, which would then give
Yep.
morality an objective basis. Perfectly fine.
Yep.
In the case of morality, I would go backwards because morality is the one I'm most interested in. In the
Yeah.
case of morality,
Yep.
the question is what is a better grounds of objective morality? Is it a conscious being or a unconscious law? And I think there's lots of different facets to that question. The first is that I think that if it's grounded in a conscious being, that makes it inherently subjective. It's stance dependent on the stances of the conscious agent, which means it can't be objective. So if you want a truly objective morality, it would have to be stance independent, grounded in something that isn't based off a conscious agent. And that would make it better grounds for what we think of as objective morality. I also think that there's lots of moral issues where specifically the God of the Old Testament, the Abrahamic God, did many things that we would see as very immoral. And so if that being is the being that grounds all objective moralities, it seems to go against all of the evidence that we have of morality. Because the only evidence we really have of morality is our moral intuitions and our moral progress. We look at things and say, drowning babies is bad. And then we look at the Bible, and God flooded the world. And so it seems like there's a conflict between our moral intuitions and what our intuitions are telling us is wrong and the actions done by the supposed grounds of objective morality in the Bible. And that I see as uh, a red flag or a argument against the God hypothesis as being a grounds of morality. Because if the God is a grounds of morality, then because it stands dependent, the God being could do anything and be immune from it being considered immoral. So it could kill lots of people, but that's fine because it stands dependent towards that being, which makes it subjective. Whereas if we on a objective version, if it's based on a law of physics or whatever, and the law of physics just in some way instantiates the principle killing is wrong or whatever, in that case, it would not be the case that it would be subjective. There would be no exceptions. Even if the law did it something, it would be immoral because it's just an objective fact of the reality or some in some sense. And so it seems like if it's grounded in a non-conscious agent, it gives us more of a grounds to lean towards objectivity than if it's grounded in an agent, which seems to make it lean towards subjectivity and make it strictly stance dependent. And so I think that a better explanation, just for that one of many arguments I have, would be for a stance independent law of physics, just like gravity, to say we really have an objective thing of morality. I do have more arguments there, but I wanted to address the other things you mentioned. So religious experience, you mentioned at the end, like you have lots of experiences on LSD or whatever, and I think that's the crucial point. How do you differentiate imagination, in this case like an LSD trip, with an actual correspondent to truth experience? How would you get from the experience itself some kind of a justification to believe that that experience is more than just like an LSD trip? How do you differentiate those two? And I've never seen a compelling answer given from any of the theists I've talked to about why we should treat their personal experience with more credence than we should treat someone on LSD. What is the differentiating factor that gives us a reason to think, to give even the experiencer a reason to think that the experience corresponds to reality more than an LSD trip? It seems like we have an abundance of evidence that the human brain does a lot of very silly things in a lot of conditions, some of them very normal. We experience tons of delusions every minute of every day because our eyes and brain just fills in the blank spaces where it doesn't know what to do. Page of optical illusions shows us this. And so we would need, it seems like experience as a way to differentiate imagination from reality on its own doesn't work because it has so many defeaters. There's just so many reasons not to trust human experience, and we need something more experience plus some sieve to filter out the bad experiences. And without that, just experience on its own, not very reliable. And so we shouldn't trust the religious experience. No one, including the experiencer, should trust the religious experience because it has so many well-known, well-documented defeaters like illusions, delusions, fallacies, biases, misconceptions, etc., etc., etc. In the context of biblical evidence, I definitely grant Jesus existed, 100%. But why would we believe, based off of the testimony in the Bible, that the miracles actually occurred? That's the question here. Which is the better explanation? Like, inference is the best explanation, as you mentioned. Did the miracles actually occur, or were they fakes, or misunderstanding, or embellished after the fact? And which is more likely? Because it seems like right off the fact that people can write books and embellish things and make things up, and that happens
Mhm.
all the time, all over the world, all throughout history. That explanation seems to have more weight than that it actually occurred. Like the David Hume argument that miracles are by definition the least likely thing to have occurred, and so it's probably, you're going to lad with a better explanation of just saying, no, it was probably faked. And so just on that one variable, the naturalist hypothesis seems to have an advantage, because here we have lots and lots of explanations that can fully explain the data in this case, which would be claims of miracles occurring in the Bible. And it being made up is a purely naturalist explanation that is extremely common to explain the full extent of that data. So going back to my analogy, if we see a hoof print in the snow, what caused it? Horse or unicorn? Horses have tons of evidence, probably go with the horse. I don't see how this case would be any different. In the case of miracles in the Bible, that's the footprint. And the footprint can be fully explained by people making stuff up, because that's happened all the time in history. And so why would we need to posit, or why would we be justified to conclude that there was actually this unicorn of actual miracles that occurred? That would be why I would think that the naturalist hypothesis, Lynn, is more supported in the Bible testimony case. And there's lots and lots of examples of why. Like, for example, many of the miracles Jesus did were extremely common during the time period. Lots of people claim to do all those things: turn water into wine, give bread and food, heal the blind and the sick. All those were extremely common. It doesn't seem like he did any really unique miracles. Like, if he did something that nobody at the time period had ever been claimed to do, or something like regrowing limbs, and that none of the people that we would both agree are fake doctors claim to be able to do, that would seem to be better evidence than claiming to do miracles that all of the fake doctors at the time claimed to do. Extremely common fake miracles. All the people did this. It was very well documented that, yeah, this is something that people claim to do very easily, because it's easy to make people believe they're getting better and have a very emotional reaction, when really you've just made their dopamine go up. Like the faith healers on TV we see here in America, where I'm going to make your foot grow, or, oh, I'm going to cure you of your back pain. And because they have this rush of dopamine, it deactivates their pain sensor, so they get up and walk. But then when they go to the doctor, yeah, they're still completely messed up. Doesn't heal them at all. And so all of these miracles that Jesus claims to have done seems to be mundane miracles that all the other people claim to have done at the time period. And so that seems to lend more credence to this is probably an embellishment. And I did want to mention the liar, lunatic, or Lord from C.S. Lewis, because that seems to be a very emotional picture to paint, that he was a bad teacher if he was a liar, or he was mad. Because I don't think that's true. I think pretty much every teacher is a liar, all of them, especially in high school, because they have no idea what they're talking about. You ask them questions about quantum physics, they're going to give you the best approximation they can. And for that level of education, it may be a good approximation, but it's completely wrong. He's 100% wrong. Like Newton trying to describe the motion of the planets using Newtonian physics. He's wrong. Like, nope, general relativity is right. Newton is wrong. Does that make Newton a bad teacher? Well, no. He was doing the best he could with the information he had to express truths that were relevant to the people of the time period. And so simply being a liar, even if he knew he wasn't completely accurate, even if Newton knew there was a better, deeper theory that could explain more than what he could explain, and so he was a liar if he claimed he'd had all the answers, he would still be a good teacher, a phenomenal teacher, because his advancements that he brought to science were so phenomenal that they revolutionized science. And so I think there's this emotional appeal of claiming that someone who is a liar is inherently a bad teacher. And that seems to be a stretch that is the crux of the liar, lunatic, or Lord argument. You can be a liar and still be a very good teacher. In fact, I think that many Christians would admit that there are very moral figures other than Jesus that existed, that tried to teach people and try to teach people like Buddha or the Jainist figures who are monks who just are extremely non-pacifist, very, very peace-loving people, or the people who like burn themselves. There's the guy who went to the Supreme Court and lit himself on fire to try to help global warming. There are activists who do very good things. And suppose he was just a liar and he knew climate change was wrong, but he still wanted to save the environment or something. He'd still be a great teacher, even though he was a liar. And so I think that argument is focused on an emotional appeal that you can't be a liar and a good teacher, which I think is wrong. And so I don't find much weight in the liar, lunatic, or Lord argument. But that's my thoughts on those three. Tell me what you think.
Well, you've given me some things to think about and respond to. I'm not sure where to start. Are you a liar?
Oh yes, all the time. I am the sexiest man alive, and I can say that 100% true.
No. You're evading the pointy bit of my question. Are you a liar?
Well, yes, I lie all the time, 100%. I absolutely do.
Okay. So where is this conversation going to go now if I have to doubt your sincerity?
Well, I think that you should never judge an argument by the speaker. So whether or not I'm lying doesn't make a difference. So like if I said 1 + 1 = 2 and I was lying or believed I was lying, the truth of the claim is to be assessed independently of the motivation of the individual saying it. And so the whether or not I lie is irrelevant to whether or not the statements I'm saying are compelling or true or meaningful. And so you should always address the arguments, not the person making the argument. So whether or not I'm lying wouldn't make a difference to the quality of the things I'm saying.
Yeah, it sounds like the argument I have with my wife about whether I should use the work of Martin Heidegger because he's a very, very clearly was a Nazi, and my wife says no, and I say, well, actually, whether he was a Nazi or not doesn't affect whether his ideas are worth listening to, enlightening, or true. So I agree halfway, but I thought we were having a conversation. And if we're having a conversation, then we're actually two human beings talking to one another who assume a level of sincerity. This whole conversation does depend on me being sincere. Now, the arguments about the existence of God, we can separate from who I am, who you are, but the conversation, being human, depends on not lying to one another, because lying is parasitic on the idea that we are not lying to each other. If we really thought all the time that people lie to each other all the time, we wouldn't have conversations because we wouldn't trust each other, etc. But anyway, that's a little bit tangential. We keep going back to the idea of, at least we keep seeming to go back to the idea of science gives us a certain sort of confirmed evidence, while other realms of quote knowledge or actually lack of knowledge don't. I want to talk about two things. First, I want to talk about your attitude to those people who maybe you have never come across any, but those people who are both committed Christians and committed, serious, hard-thinking, philosophical, scientific types. And then the second thing I want to go back to is the problem of underdetermination. But and then there's a whole bunch of other things. But seriously, we have. Let me start with the Christian world. In the Christian world, you can come across people who think, well, if you're not a Christian, you must be an idiot. You just haven't looked at the evidence. So there's a few of those people around. But dare I say it, and no offense intended, in the atheist naturalist world, there are a lot more of them. That is to say, there are a lot more people who say, if you're not an atheist naturalist, you just haven't looked at the evidence because it's pretty obvious. Now, the problem is, what does "it's pretty obvious" mean when faced with people who seem to be sincere, hard-thinking philosophers? Let's talk about philosophers, but we could talk about scientists too. But one of the lines about the scientist will be, oh, well, scientists can do good science, but they're not philosophers necessarily. Although, to quote one of your ilk, Lawrence Krauss, he was, I will get back to my main train of thought, but he was in Melbourne and I interviewed him here in Melbourne. And I asked him a question that was a little bit of a trap question, but I knew he wouldn't mind it. And I said, what do you say to those people who say that as a scientist, you should be careful about wading into the depths of philosophy and theology? And he gave me just the perfect sort of quotation that I was hoping for. He said, as a scientist, I don't wade into the depths of philosophy and theology. There are no depths of philosophy and theology. That is Googleable somewhere. You can even listen to the interview.
So it's Stephen Hawking's
course,
level. Philosophy is dead.
Yeah, that's right. And you know, I mean, if I'm talking to somebody like that, I don't quite know where to go because technically speaking, when Lawrence Krauss says there are no depths of you don't, and the second part of his quotation was, you don't need philosophy to do science. Now, of course, technically speaking, he shoots himself in the foot there because he is making a statement that doesn't arise from science, it arises from the philosophy of science. Now, that sort of thing is pretty common amongst the new atheists, sort of committed to science but haven't thought very hard philosophically. They do tend to shoot themselves in the foot a little bit. But that's not the people I'm talking about. I'm talking about you, and I am taking you to be somebody who is atheist, naturalist, and hard-thinking philosophically. What do you make of the committed Christian, committed in the sense of, you know, resurrection of Jesus happened, God exists, Jesus was God in the flesh, but they are also globally recognized philosophers or scientists, but philosophers particularly because philosophers are the people who are meant to be hard thinkers. And, you know, I mean, here in Australia, I can name some on the international stage, Richard Swinburne now, Alvin Plantinga. You know, these people are not lightweights. What do you make of them?
I see them as no different than any other scientist. I think that, like myself, so I believe in objective morality, but I admit there's no evidence of it. But it's my hypothesis. I really like it, and I'm looking for evidence as hard as I can. Just like Einstein did. Einstein created his theory of general relativity. He had no evidence, none whatsoever. It's just his theory. He's like, you know, if I'm right, what would I expect to do? Well, I would expect to measure curvature of light around the sun. I expect to explain the pure helium mercury, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
And so every single scientist ever has a pet idea. That's their pet idea. And they are going to, with determination, try to find all the evidence they can to support that idea. And the theists are no different. They have their preferred hypothesis, which is a God hypothesis, and they believe it and search for all the evidence they can to support it, just like anybody does. And they already believe it before they found the evidence, just like Einstein already believed his theory before he found the evidence, just like I already believe my morality theory before we even found any evidence. And so I don't see there's any psychological problem or delusion with people who believe that way. And I don't think there's any problem with believing in God. I talked to Pete Inns. He's a philosopher here in Pennsylvania in America. And he's a fide, or not a fide, what is it? Someone who believes that there's no evidence, but still believes in God.
Yeah.
Is that a fideist?
Yep.
So fideist, who says...
Roughly, yep.
He grants that there's no empirical evidence. The arguments and evidence don't lean towards theism.
Hold on. Just, can you just stop for a minute?
Sure.
Please. Back to this word evidence. You just used the word evidence. You said something like, he thinks there's no evidence, and then you said empirical evidence. In other words, you're aligning the two, and that's okay if you think the only sort of evidence is empirical. But if you don't, then evidence and empirical evidence are not the same thing. Empirical evidence is a subset. So anyway,
Sure. Absolutely.
carry on.
Absolutely.
Sorry about that.
No
Carry on.
problem. Well, so again, I want to be. This is a very common collision of ideas. The common distinction between types of evidence. This is the thing that comes up quite often in these debates. And I want to be as general as possible. Say any evidence is just anything that can increase the probability that your hypothesis in your imagination is true, corresponds to something in
Not
reality.
imagination. Yep.
What?
Yep.
Not imagination. What do you mean?
Yep. Oh, that's what evidence is what distinguishes between
Yes.
the real and the imaginative. Yes.
So in this case, imagination would just be you have a hypothesis in your head, an idea of how you think the world is. It's imagination. And evidence is something that increases the probability that the world is actually that way and not just a figment of your imagination. So differentiate imagination from reality is the catchy way I make that shorter and entertaining to people. And so the theists like Pete say, yes, we agree that none of the evidence, as far as we can tell, does that. And he still believes. And I think that's perfectly rational. There's nothing irrational about that. The only thing that I think is irrational is when you claim there's evidence when there isn't, like a flat earther. The world is flat, and the evidence is you can't see a curve. You can literally see a curve. That's irrational. And so my interest is more, do the arguments and evidence actually differentiate imagination from reality? That's what I'm focused on. I think it's perfectly rational to have a hypothesis of a God. And you can even make predictions. When you die, you go to heaven. If that happens, that is phenomenal evidence. I will be, yep, you were right. I was wrong. My hypothesis says that won't happen. Yours says it does. If that happens, you have all the evidence. I lose. And so I think any kind of evidence, any kind of way that can differentiate the fact that it's just a hypothesis, imagination, with it actually being true, I would accept. But I haven't seen any of the ways that are not science that do that. I'm open to it, perfectly fine. But like in the case of religious experience or historical evidence, those seem to have just an abundance of defeaters. And so the reason I wouldn't accept those as evidence is because they don't seem to work any other place in history to differentiate imagination from reality. Like there's a paper by Mike Lacona of Historians and Miracle Claims, where he goes through the reasons why historians don't accept miracle claims in any historical document, Hinduism, Buddhism, the Iliad, the Odyssey, whatever. It's because historians aren't allowed to make ontological commitments about reality or something along those lines, where like, so miracles, magic, mythical creatures, paranormal, supernatural, those kinds of things can't be justified by historical testimony. You need more. For the same reason you would need more in a courtroom today. If somebody goes in and says, magic is real, he used Avada Kedavra on my grandmother and killed her with a wizarding spell, the testimony, even if you had like 1,000 people who just saw it happen, he waved a wand and a green light came out and she died, that would not be enough to convict him because there's no precedent that magic is real. First, you'd have to say, how do we show magic is real? And then you can convict him based off of the testimony. But the testimony doesn't count as a basis for a new ontological thing. And the same thing would apply 2,000 years or testimony from 2,000 years ago. If there are these people, the apostles, claiming that they saw a guy wave a wand and a green light came out and somebody died, we would not be justified in believing magic was real, for the exact same reason we wouldn't in a courtroom. And so the historical basis, I think, is great for the testimony of their lives, but I don't think it works for the miracles and magic, mythical creatures, etc. And I think that isn't just a scientific bias. I don't think we're just saying because we only accept empirical evidence. I think it's because testimony doesn't work in so many cases. It's so bad that's why we accept it. Not because we're just limiting ourselves to science, but because the thing you're using is just so bad.
Okay. I hear you. I won't respond further to that except to go to the underdetermination problem. And this is sort of, pushing Humean type skepticism. If we're going to rely so much on a particular sort of evidence, so first of all, if I've heard you clearly, you're a naturalist plus. That is to say, you're a naturalist, and for your naturalism, you have what we call evidence in science, roughly. And you have a plus there because you're convinced that we live in an objectively moral universe, and the best way you can offer. I'm asking you this. I'm not sort of putting ideas on you. The best explanation of the objectively moral universe that we live in is that there are objectively moral laws or an objective moral framework akin to the laws of quantum physics, which we don't see, but they're there, but they're actually not testable in the same way that the laws of quantum physics are. So the plus, the naturalism plus, the plus represents a sort of a speculation in order to hold on to a conviction that torturing the innocent is wrong in all places and all times, rather than just something that evolution or our culture has given us. Is that roughly right?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. It sounds like a great summary.
Okay. So on that basis, aren't you holding on to a huge exception to the whole naturalist bit? Isn't the plus a huge exception? I mean, you may say, yes, it is a huge exception, but I'm so convinced that we live in an objective moral universe that I think that that's just a truth that, dare I use these words, that I personally experience, and my experience is so powerful for me that I don't want to let go of something that can't fit into my naturalistic framework. Am I misrepresenting you there? And I know I haven't got on to underdetermination. We will. But am I misrepresenting you, Tom?
Sort of, yes. So I don't think it's a misrepresentation. I think it's a misinterpretation. So my position would be is I grant that the morality is a plus. It is an addition onto contemporary scientific naturalism. There is not evidence for it. The difference is I admit there is no evidence for it. It's a hypothesis. I have no evidence.
Yep.
I'm trying to look at the past evidence and make an inference. And I hope there will be evidence in the future and make predictions that might be discovered. And so I believe it purely based off of the fact that I like it. It makes me happy. And I hope that my predictions will be discovered in future. Which I, as I mentioned earlier, like a fideist, perfectly fine. Perfectly rational to, as long as you admit there's no evidence and you believe it because you like it, perfectly fine. But
you do think it is. You make that, to quote Michael Polanyi, you make that claim with universal intent, don't you? You're not saying that there is an objective morality to the universe for me. You think that all human beings, whatever their beliefs, actually live within some sort of moral framework that they ought to, because that's the definition of a moral framework, that they ought to comply with. And part of complying with that is you think that all human beings should not torture the innocent, irrespective of their cultural beliefs or what their fascist dictator tells them to do.
Yes, I'm making a truth claim that is objectively true, independent of what anybody thinks. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we're clear on that. So my question is, isn't that an argument from experience? An argument from experience that is untestable, like the argument from experience of the Christian who says, I experienced God, or the Hindu, and like the argument from experience of the person who says, experience tells me that, well, look, I don't actually want to make a statement because I'm thinking of horrific things that some deluded person might say, experience tells me it's right to do this. And we can all imagine what sorts of things might fall under that category. Or, simple torture the innocent. The argument from experience that torturing the innocent brings me so much pleasure. And when one's in a situation where that's possible, it's an obligation to do so. Or, some weird argument that's speculation. Weird. I say weird because most of the people in the room would think it was weird because we actually have some moral convictions about that torturing the innocent is bad news.
So I think the part there that I disagree with is the argument part. So I think that if I said I'm justified in believing
Yeah.
in this moral law because of my experience, that would be an argument from experience, and I think that would be irrational. Now, I'm not saying because of my experience I'm justified in believing this. I'm saying I believe it because I like it. That's it. There's no evidence there. It's not that my experience gives
Okay.
me a evidential justification or an evidential basis that this is
Okay.
true. And then I try to find patterns in moral intuition and moral progress and try to find predictions of what we'd
Okay.
expect in the future. And if those get discovered, those would be evidence. Like if my
Yeah.
prediction that humans will eventually start to see morality as applicable to non-sentient creatures, that if a rock falls on you, that'll have moral significance. That's a prediction I would make. If my model is correct, that's what we would expect to see in the future. And if that happens, that would be some evidence that my model is correct. But until then, I have no evidence. My experience does
Yeah.
not give me evidence. It just gives me a nice fuzzy feeling.
So you seem to be, I don't know, tell me if this is right. You seem to be pretty committed to the idea that there is an objective moral framework, or however we phrase it. But I think what I heard just then was the only reason you're committed to the idea is because you like it.
Yes, that
Now,
is correct. It is my
now
hypothesis, which makes me feel good.
how does that go with all the things and all the arguments that could be based on this makes me feel good? I mean, how? But I guess you can say, well, no, Chris, you're just looking for more evidence, and I acknowledge that I don't have evidence. But there are going to be a lot of people in the world who say, what makes me feel good is torturing the innocent. And by the way, for those people listening, the reason I say torturing the innocent is because there are plausible arguments for torturing those who we think are guilty, but those who we know are innocent, I think torturing those people makes the example a stark contrast. I noticed somebody in the chat said, what about torturing the guilty? Well, I'm trying to find a stark contrast that almost everybody would agree with.
Yeah,
But
that's
yeah, just
perfectly rational. That's why I
yeah,
used the drowning babies example earlier. It
yeah,
should be
yeah,
pretty
that's right.
universally.
Absolutely, yeah. But I like it. Yeah, okay. Maybe I don't have any more to say about that, and maybe you've said what you can say about that. Maybe I should go to underdetermination. Underdetermination, and this is where I think we can be. Let me push a sort of more David Humean skeptical line and say, well, it's easy to have confidence in the progress of science when bridges hold up and rockets do land on the moon, and they even come back and they land upright so we can reuse them. It's just phenomenal, isn't it?
And blow up in the atmosphere accidentally
Well, they
6
did.
times.
That's right. They do that too, don't they? So it's easy to just assume things about science, but we do know that. A short little maths lesson. If we have, and I know lots of people listening already know this, but in case anybody doesn't, if you have 4 points on an XY axis and on an XY plane, and they look like they're a straight line, and you ask, what is the relationship between X and Y? The instant guess is that it's a straight line. But anyone who's done first year university maths knows that there are actually an infinite number of equations that will go through those 4 points. And adding more points doesn't help, because you can always add more. You can always find an infinite number of equations to go through any number of points on a plane. So that's a representation of the fact that there are always other possibilities for scientific explanations. And it's not that any scientific explanation is quite obviously right. it's only obviously right if you bring in ideas like simplicity, beauty, coherence, fruitfulness, and a whole lot of non-scientific terms that lead us to say E does equal mc squared, or whatever it happens to be. But the speculative scientist, though we might call them a non-scientist at this stage, the speculative person can always offer another explanation. And of course, that's what Christians get accused of doing. You know, they're offering such complicated explanations for things that could be much simpler. And of course, it was a Christian, although that's irrelevant, that gave us that law that we ought to accept the simpler explanation over the more complicated one. But we can't justify that. We can, William of Occam's razor. We can't justify that, even though in our hearts, oh, there's some religious language. In our hearts, we believe it to be true. And I can hear people saying, no, you don't think with your heart, you think with your head. We believe it to be true that we ought to go for the simpler explanation. But Copernicus came along and said that one of the most successful scientific theories of all time was wrong, that the Earth-centered universe was wrong. Well, he didn't quite. He said the mathematics would work better if the sun were the center of the universe, and then Galileo came along and said it's not just mathematics, the Earth moves. But Ptolemy could have kept on adding epicycles and more complexity to keep on catering for the new information that the telescope gives us and all the rest of it. We could find other scientific theories that are more complicated that still cover the bases, but we don't believe them. But it's not because there's some sort of absolute proof. It's because a bunch of people that we call scientists have banged their heads together and come to a conclusion and given us the scientific consensus on something. They banged their heads together and they all nodded eventually and said E equals mc squared. Or currently today, there are a whole bunch of people out there. Now, I'm not sure which way this is going to go with North American audience, but let me do it anyway. There are a whole bunch of people out there, all of whom are experts at some aspect of what contributes to climate science. And this bunch of people have come to a consensus, not univocal, but a consensus that human beings are causing dangerous global warming. No one of them can prove it. And if you put them on a stand and said, prove it, they'd say, well, that's not how science works. It's the inference to the best explanation that arises from the conversation that thousands of people around the world are having through their scientific papers and their conferences, and we're convinced human beings are causing global warming. And it's a fraudster that says there is proof in any very strong sense, because as the climate skeptics play on, and I'm sure there are probably lots of people here who are skeptics, as the climate skeptics know very well, there could be other explanations. There could always be other explanations. So I'm just pushing back against the idea that you're stupid if you don't believe that it's a straight line that links these 4 points, because you're not stupid. You might actually be more sophisticated and know that there's an infinite number, and let's not rule out the other possibilities yet. There you go. End of my fifth ramble.
Oh, yeah, I absolutely agree. I'm very familiar with the problem of underdetermination. It states that there are infinitely many. Yeah, sure. It's infinitely many hypotheses that can explain all empirical data, no matter what, forever. 100% agree. 100%. And I think that the best. I don't like simplicity. I think simplicity is dumb. The explanation of lightning was not simple, not at all. Particles in the atmosphere rubbing together, producing an electrical field that then zaps things. Like Thor was simpler. Thor was wrong. So I like Newtonian gravity. That was a very simple explanation. It was wrong. General relativity is very complicated.
Roughly right in the realm of middle-sized dry goods and planets.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I fully grant that underdetermination is a real thing, and I like to use, I think, fruitfulness, I think is the word you used for it. The ability to accurately predict the future, I think, is the best principle to establish some kind of hypothesis as being better than another one. If this one can predict the future before we know it, that's great. All of the other theories can then use post hoc rationalization to make it fit their theory because of underdetermination. We don't really care about that. Which one can do it first before we know it? That's a really good one. We should probably go with that one. And I think that is a
I agree
good.
completely. I'm just raising, yeah. It's not that I'm
Sure,
disagreeing with you.
sure.
Yeah.
So I would, in my model, what would make religious experience and biblical testimony rational to believe would be as if it did that, if it was able to predict the future and get it right before we know it. Like if the things in Revelation actually happened in the future, that would be great evidence. Like if we die and go to heaven, great evidence. If Jesus actually comes back and there's this brown Middle Eastern man and all of the Americans are like, no, put him in prison, that would be great evidence.
Oh, is that a political comment?
What? I would
Yeah,
never.
right.
What?
Where? Guantanamo?
Yep.
Okay,
So
carry on.
I definitely think that the problem of underdetermination is a real problem, and I think, but I don't know how it relates specifically to the implications of types of evidence in the conversation we've had. Because even if underdetermination is true, and God is obviously a logically possible, depends on the kind of God. Maybe Trinity
Yeah.
may not be logically possible. A logically possible explanation to explain the data. Why would we prioritize that explanation over a naturalistic one, like the straight line versus the parabola, if we have evidence that certain kinds of lines exist and they've done things in the past and we're able to make predictions in the past and get it right before we know it very consistently, then it seems rational to just to think that that kind of a line is the one connecting the dots. And then to say if it was a new kind of a line, while obviously that would be possible, it seems like it would be irrational to prioritize that line over the ones that have already been demonstrated to successfully predict the future, like induction, white goose, white goose, white goose. What's the next one? It's a black goose. Like that's not rational. It could be, yes, it could be a black goose, but we should probably go with white goose because it's been white goose every other time so far. And so, if that's the case, then it seems like assuming a naturalist explanation would be more rational because we have past evidence of naturalist explanations being able to predict the future. And since we don't have any evidence of supernaturalist hypotheses being able to predict the future, that one would be the outlier, the black goose, the god of the gaps. And so why would religious experience or historical evidence give us reason to believe there is actually a black goose there? Why shouldn't we prioritize the white goose naturalistic explanation that seems so prevalent, like delusion, illusion, misconception, hallucination, or um, embellishment of historical stories? Why wouldn't that be the white goose that we should expect? And then you can still believe in a black goose, but just say it has less evidence, and I think that's perfectly rational.
Yeah. I agree with a lot of what you said in the sense that um, we ought to follow where the evidence leads. And while I highlight the fact, the underdetermination problem, I still think that the best way forward is to assume the straight line rather than and then test it, obviously. But sorry, I just lost my train of thought there while I was trying to before. But the whole that's right. Yes, I wanted to go back. Well, you did dangle it in front of me, didn't you? The problem of induction, um, and that's another place that I would push back and say we have to recognise, along with the underdetermination problem, we have to recognise that science and our common ways of thinking are absolutely committed to a particular way of thinking, white goose, white goose, white goose, so the next one's probably not going to be black, that we can't philosophically justify, that we are committed to. I am committed to it too. But it's very difficult to philosophically justify why we expect the next one to be a white goose, and we can't appeal to the fact that the past has demonstrated this, because that is an inductive argument in support of using inductive arguments. But these are philosophical pushbacks, not to say science isn't great, and not to say that I'm not committed to science, because I am, but it's just to loosen up this idea that a lot of people seem to have, and you not so much, but I've been able to glance at the chat a little bit, but to loosen up this idea that science is this sort of monolithical, absolute thing, a black box where you drop data in and out pops the theories, and then you pop the theories into the next black box, out pops the confirmation, and it's all sealed up, and that's it. Science isn't like that. That's not how scientists work in practice. And, I was yesterday I was with an evolutionary biologist who was talking about a whole lot of things, but he was quite happy to say, science gets it wrong, science corrects itself, science works on what it thinks is the best view of the moment. So all I'm saying there is not that science is untrustworthy, but let's make sure we've got a decent philosophy of science rather than a naive view of science. And to put in a plug for my most favourite philosopher of science, I think that Michael Polanyi, a Hungarian Jew who finished up in England and wrote his major work, Personal Knowledge, in 1958. I think he, prominent scientist, but then turned to philosophy of science. I think he's brilliant. And for those of you who are into philosophy of science, Thomas Kuhn wrote his work in 1962, Polanyi in 58, and Polanyi's biographer says, and I agree, all that is good in Kuhn is found in Polanyi. But Kuhn coined a few phrases like paradigm and scientific revolution and normal science and anomalies, coined a few phrases that made it very catchy. He also wrote a thin, accessible book rather than a thick, semi-philosophical book. But anyway, Michael Polanyi, he talks about personal knowledge, and he says that science is both subjective and objective. It's objective in the sense that it has universal intent. It's trying to make truth claims about the real world, and it claims we get in touch with that world. But it's subjective because every scientific truth claim is a personal commitment by a person. So when Einstein in 1905 writes a number of scientific papers, he is putting his personal opinion in the public space for people to agree or disagree. And he's effectively saying, believe me, here's the reasons for believing me. This is what I think is true, just as you're doing, Tom, with objective morality. You're putting a claim out there. You're not offering evidence for it yet, except maybe the human moral sense. So the personal element is there too, and the personal element also includes, to quote Polanyi, I've written this book to justify what I believe to be true, that is science, even though I know that it might conceivably be false. Philosophical speculation can question anything. So that throws us, I think that throws us back into the realm of a conversation about science and about the place of science in a claimed bigger worldview, a conversation where we're not going to find agreement, but where each one of us arrives at our own considered opinion about these things, and on no side is there hands down evidence that I'm right and you're wrong. And the way we even, as has come out of our conversation, the way that we even interpret, quote, evidence, or what we take to be evidence, is also a personal choice. I choose, ultimately, I listen to the scholars when they talk about historical texts in the Gospels, but ultimately I have to commit myself to what I think about what this scholar says and this scholar says and this scholar says about how trustworthy the Gospels are in giving us the life of Jesus and other things like that. And again, thinking about Polanyi, I always have to take personal responsibility for the things that I believe, and I can't pretend that I am forced to believe some things because I've just looked at the arguments and the arguments are so compelling that I am forced into atheist naturalism or forced into Christianity or forced into whatever other worldview. We're not forced into it. We carefully, well, some of us think, okay, I acknowledge that some people will say, oh, you're just deluding yourself. But some of us think that we carefully consider what other people have to say, we try and understand them, we try and listen to them, and then we commit to what we do believe, or we arrive at what we do believe, even though it might be different to what some other bright spark thinks.
Sure, absolutely. I think I would agree with everything you said there. The one thing you mentioned we should have a good epistemology of science, I think is something along those lines, of what the principles we should adopt in science should be. And I think that's the part where the most interesting aspects of the conversation between theist and atheist is, because I think there are certain kinds of things that many theists accept as evidence, like religious experience, that I think have so many defeaters. It's hard for me to understand, why do you accept that as evidence? Like, I can understand it's really powerful. Like, I've had personal experiences. I used to be religious. I was a Christian till I was in my late teens. And so I know how powerful these religious experiences are.
Hmm.
But I also have studied enough about personal experience to know how bad it is. There was a testimony of a woman who claims to have been raped by a very famous person. And they found out that she had actually just fallen asleep watching him on a television, a live screen television show, and her brain then interpreted his words into this vast imagination of dream thing, which she thought was happened in her present experience moment,
Yeah,
which is an extremely common psychological phenomenon,
yeah,
especially in near-death experiences. If your brain shuts off at the wrong time, you're going to still be experiencing stuff, and it's going to be saved to your conscious memory. And so when
yeah.
you wake up, you're going to be very confused. And so we know how bad personal experience is at assessing reality when it comes to things that don't already have a very strong past history. And so the fact that it's accepted as evidence and given as one of the lead examples of why people believe is very confusing to me, because that seems to be like, if we're trying to make a good epistemology of how to like, what things should we use as being rational to believe, what things we shouldn't use, personal experience should be like the bottom of the barrel. Like, this is not something we should use. This is the thing we should use to maybe build a hypothesis, but never
Mm-hmm.
as the core
Mm-hmm.
of the evidence. Kind of like my model of morality. Like, I believe it's true. I have these moral intuitions, I experience them, but I can't say that this is a justification to believe it's true about the universe because I have this experience. It's a great way to start a hypothesis about that and then try to look for other reasons. But I can't just say
Yeah.
that's the reason. That would seem very silly to me. And that's what it looks to me like what many Christians are doing when they say my personal
Mm-hmm.
experience. And to me, that seems like a bad scientific epistemology or bad epistemology in general.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about when you talk about that stuff, you're talking about epistemology in general. You're not talking about scientific. Otherwise, you're once again um, favouring a naturalistic worldview. But I, I agree with you. I agree with you in the way that what you said could be understood. But pushing back on the subjectivity of all of our beliefs, including our most scientific beliefs, the sense that now you don't normally speak about it this way, but why do you believe that E equals mc squared? You don't normally say, because my weighed up experience of hearing physics teachers and reading physics books, my weighed up experience leads me to the conviction that E equals mc squared. Now, we don't normally talk about experience of in that way, but what I'm pointing to is the subjectivity of the commitments that we make. And I assume most people here are committed to the idea that E equals mc squared. But that still is a personal commitment. Now, I think it's a personal commitment with universal intent. It's not just a subjective thing. It's a subjective commitment to something that I believe is objectively true, if you want to use that sort of language. But I still have to take responsibility for that. So in a sense, and I agree I'm using the word experience in a very broadened sense, in a sense, it's an experience, it's an argument from experience. My experience of my physics teachers and trusting them, and my physics textbook and trusting it, and all the other people around the world who have said that E equals mc squared. It's not because I'm Einstein and I've done the calculations, or I'm whatever the name of the people who went 20 years later and watched the curvature of Venus, was it, around the sun, or whatever?
Curvature of light. Einstein actually did the experiment
curvature of a
himself,
star around the sun, wasn't it? Yeah, but I don't think Einstein did that experiment. I think the experiment was done in about 1920, and two groups of people went to do it, and one got clouds and one didn't. And fortunately, one of them didn't get clouds, and they observed it. But yeah, our convictions, whether they're scientific or religious or whatever, are all ultimately based on our personal seal of approval to something that we, and again, I'm using the word experience in a funny sense, that we have experienced. So once again, I'm pushing the idea that, I guess I haven't said it this way. I'm pushing the idea that our ultimate conviction, we arrive at our ultimate convictions about science, about religion, about whatever, through a similar sort of process, even though the objects of knowledge are very different. And I would say that process is an interpretive process. It's a commitment to there being universal truths. It's a provisional process, because if we're honest, we've got to say, I might be wrong. As a Christian, I'm happy to say I might be wrong. So it's a provisional process, and it's a fiduciary process. It's a process of trusting. I could not possibly believe that E equals mc squared if I didn't trust lots of people, whether it's the book on my shelf or the physics professor or whoever it is. Takes us back to lying, doesn't it? I could not possibly believe that E equals mc squared if I had this conviction that people do lots of lying, and it's pretty difficult to work out when they do and when they don't. Yeah. But we might have started to go in circles. I'm not sure, but it's been very interesting.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And again, I think I would agree with everything you said there, but I think my core question is still there, still yet to be answered, which is while we do, like, obviously I experienced reading the textbook about E equals mc squared, and I experienced the testable results, and I experienced doing some similar experiments with light and stuff. And those are all experiences that I use to justify my belief in E equals mc squared. But the question is are there things that we can eliminate as good justifications? Like if we use a broken compass, I have a broken compass or a magic 8-ball, and I just shake it and it says, these are the lottery numbers. Well, we can test that multiple times and realize that that is a bad method. It's still going to be an experience. You can still put your stamp of approval on it, but we can say that is an objectively bad. Don't do that, because we know it doesn't work.
You should not put your stamp of approval on a broken compass, and we can definitely eliminate the broken compass, because I say definitely, not in the absolute sense, because perhaps it's the good compass and all the other compasses in the world are broken.
Right.
But no, the sensible person says, I don't give my approval to the broken compass. I agree, we can eliminate things that really are not evidential. Our argument is about what is evidential and what isn't. And hear me clearly, I'm not resting my case on religious experience being top of the pile. I think that religious experience, I agree with you. Religious experience is variable. Everybody has religious experience, or most people do at some time in their life, etc., etc. If you ask me why I'm a Christian, I'll say historical challenge, a certain worldview that leads me, I believe certain things to be true, like objective morality and other aspects of the human being and a whole lot of, that leads me to think if Christianity were true, it would be the best explainer of everything. It's the most comprehensive worldview that gives me a framework for holding on to the things that I believe to be true, like morality, like science. I believe science to be true. I believe we live in a rational universe. There's no reason I should believe that if we recognize the problem of induction, but I do believe that. In fact, I believe in the inductive method, even though I can't justify it. And I do believe that human beings are in touch with reality, that we're not in the matrix. And these are, if you like, these are my base beliefs. My base beliefs that you are a real person, that we live in a real world, that there is a hand in front of my face, that there is morality to this universe, that humans are getting in touch with the truth about the natural world through science. A whole lot of fundamental beliefs that I have. And Christianity, for me, makes the most sense of those beliefs. So that's historical evidence is one. The whole inference to the best explanation of what I fundamentally take to be true is another. Religious experience, yes, is another. But I personally, maybe, it's predictable, I guess, engineer, philosophy. I personally don't rely on religious experience a lot. I have my good days and my bad days. I might get up one morning and say, if I were really slightly Pentecostal, I might get up in the morning and wave my arms and say, God is good. And the next morning I might get up and say, shit, what's going on with the world? And, are you there? Religious experience comes and goes, So I guess if I had to sum it up in a context like this, I'm a Christian because I think it's the inference to the best explanation. That's the non-theological answer. There is a theological answer, but you have to be a believer to believe the theological answer. I'm a Christian, the theological answer. I'm a Christian because God grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and said, hey, buddy, but that's a more theological inference to the best explanation. I think I'd leave it there.
Sure. Yeah, you said something that I found really interesting. The most comprehensive worldview to keep hold of what you believe in, or the core things that you believe in. I think that's a really interesting way to phrase it. I definitely wrote that down to think more about that.
So it's like you believing in the objective morality of the universe. I have a whole lot of those beliefs that, and I know I can't say this because it's a total counterfactual, but if I were not a Christian, I would still think that the universe is a moral universe, that human beings are so amazingly capable of both good and evil. And having believed in a moral universe, I'm allowed to use the words good and evil. It's an extraordinary conundrum that human beings are so capable of good and so capable of evil, and that we are just not progressing. I mean, this world in the 21st century, and look around at what is still going on in terms of wars or pedophilia or whatever. Why aren't we progressing? These are questions that I'm looking for answers for, and that that I find coherent explanations for in Christianity. Now, that doesn't mean I want to justify either everything done by Christians or in the name of Christianity, and nor do I want to get into debates about the ethics of the Old Testament and all that sort of thing. I mean, that's we could go there, but that's another story.
Sure.
When I talk about Christianity, let's just talk about the core, which is historical claims about Jesus and teaching of Jesus, which is summed up in love God and love your neighbour, and then that gets teased out a bit more, etc.
Sure.
Yeah.
There was a question I promised I'd ask.
Sure.
Jeff
And I
asked,
love that question from Organic Perception. I just happened to glance again at the chat. Organic Perception says, where is it? What the heck is God doing about it all? Let me just whisper, I better not say this too publicly, but to all the atheists present, this is definitely your strongest argument against the existence of God. If you're willing to acknowledge that there is evil in the world, then I think your strongest argument is, if God is good and all-powerful and all-knowing, well, what the heck is God doing about it? And that is a profound question that any thinking Christian has to ask themselves. There are some leads into answers, but it's not a question that's been thoroughly answered. There are various things you can say about it, and maybe the most profound thing that a Christian says about it is that Christianity uniquely believes in the God who made everything, but who becomes man and actually suffers. So the God who is not immune to suffering. But yes, that is the hardest question. And that's a question that I think we all wrestle with. And of course, the atheist who believes, well, I think that it's a problem for atheists as well, if you have this core conviction that there is good and evil. Why do we have this core conviction that there is, I mean, poor Richard Dawkins, and he's not like you, Tom, because he's trying, at least when he wrote River Out of Eden, he's trying to say the atheist view of the universe is that there is ultimately no good and no evil. No, it's a blind, pitiless universe. There is no objective moral framework. But the story of Richard Dawkins' life since then has been a battle against the evils of religion. And now he's a cultural Christian, at least a self-defined cultural Christian, although he always liked Evensong. Well, maybe he'll take the next step. I'm waiting for him to take the next step and say, maybe Jesus was a messenger from God, because I do like his morality. Anyway, I better stop talking. What was the question you were going to ask?
Yes. Is empathy required for morality?
Look, I'll give you an answer. This is not my thought through answer, but I'll say what I think about that. No, I don't think so. If you can find a moral code that you just sort of live by non-empathetically. So, for example, the simplistic view of Christianity is that it's a moral code. So you don't need empathy to just live by it, although you're going to find some contradictions there and think, well, do I do this or do I do this? But you could hypothetically live by a moral code. And I think that there's probably people on this watching this that are self-identified on a spectrum people. Some people may self-recognize as being somebody who doesn't really get other people very much and doesn't have a lot of intuitive empathy for other people. But that doesn't mean, I'm assuming I'm I'm assuming I'm just stating what you think. That doesn't mean you can't be moral, because even if you don't get other people and don't feel for other people, you can still know that it's wrong to hit somebody else just because you feel like it. And so that becomes a law that you obey. Well, you don't have to be empathetic to believe your parents when they say, don't hit other people when you're angry with them. And so you just live by that. You don't have to be empathetic about it. But so anyway, no, I don't think. But I don't know. Maybe I'm missing some of the point, Tom, because you wanted to ask me that question. Do you think there's more to that question that I'm missing?
Well, no, I actually agree. I think that if morality is objective, like there are many cases, like David Wood is a Christian on YouTube, and he was diagnosed with sociopathy. He can't
Yeah, right.
feel empathy at all, but he can still understand what morality is with a framework, like a social framework or religious framework, and act in a moral way based
Yep.
on that framework, even though he doesn't feel any empathy whatsoever. So I do think that's a really interesting
Yeah,
question
right.
that brings up the idea that because there are people who don't have any empathy and they can still act moral, it's a very interesting way to think about why that is from an evolutionary perspective. And is it purely just a social
Mm,
adaptation or something more? So I do think that's a very interesting question.
yeah. Yeah, look, it is an interesting question. And I guess, if you go into moral theories, there are three main ways of thinking about moral theories. One of them is obeying the rules. One of them is just becoming a good person, and therefore whatever you do will be the right thing to do. That's virtue theory. And then one of them is consequentialism, where there's a sort of ultimate rule, like maximizing happiness, and you basically do anything you can to fulfill the ultimate rule, whether it's maximizing happiness or satisfaction or whatever. Personally, I think the obeying the rules thing is the first stage we come to, because a child, at least, doesn't understand all the empathetic stuff, and we're all different. So the obeying the rules thing is something that we can all get. Now, not all of us finish up like Jesus. I just taking Jesus as an exemplar of, a highly moral person. I don't think I'm like Jesus. For Jesus, whatever he decided to do would have been the right thing, probably, because it would have just flowed out of being such a good person. But some of us, self included, need a few more guidelines than that, because and the utilitarian, the consequentialist thing plays into both those theories as well, because we always have to think about the consequences of our actions. But without empathy, you can still think about consequences. You can still obey rules.
But actually, there was a recent question. Destiny, a big YouTuber, was recently asked if he had to pick one religion or one person, who would be the most moral one to follow, and he picked Jesus. And I thought that was really interesting because I don't see Jesus as particularly moral. It's like there's an analogy I like to use about a doctor. If a doctor in the 1800s is trying to save you, you got shot in the leg, doctor's trying to save you, best option is to cut your leg off. He doesn't have
Yep.
any antibacterials. Best he can do is cut your leg off. So he does it and saves your life. If a doctor today cut your leg off, that doctor would be sued for malpractice
Yep.
instantly. Just be like, you're done. You have antibiotics. You just give him a shot. You cut his leg off. That's just gratuitous suffering. And I think the same thing applies in the case of Jesus. If Jesus was just a normal guy, then he's incredibly moral, because what he did was helped as many people as possible. But if he's God, an all-powerful being, then the fact that he gave 500 or 5,000 fish instead of 5,001 or 5,002 or 5 million means that he's more like the doctor, the modern doctor who cut your leg off, because he had access to so many more options but didn't do them. And
Yep.
so I think if Jesus was just a guy, yes, he's very moral. If Jesus was God, I don't think he was very moral.
Yep. I'll take that question on notice. Yeah. I hear what you're saying.
All right,
But
let's
of
see. There's
course, it raises lots of other questions. Yeah.
yes. Um, Here's a question. Oh, this is one that I was also questioning, because you said why aren't we progressing? I think we are progressing. I think humanity's been progressing for a very long time. It's just slowly, but Do you assume humanity is degrading because it fits your religious narrative? How do you reconcile with the evolution of parenting and childhood?
Yeah, I've got two responses to that. I've got two responses to do I see humanity degrading? I'm not saying we're not progressing in some ways. I think it's a fantastic thing that fewer people are dying of hunger today, so many fewer than were then, because of the Green Revolution, because of people deciding to give money, because of some tech people who got very rich deciding to give their money away, for whatever reasons. I think it's great. We are progressing in many respects. But I don't think that human beings are becoming better people. I think that the flaw in human beings, which I find in myself, and let me make a really provocative claim, I think that all people, if they look inside themselves, will find in themselves. If you have a moral sense, then part of that moral sense is probably to say, I have this moral sense, but I don't actually live up to being what I think I would like to live up to being. In Aristotelian terms, I have a purpose, but I don't quite fulfill my purpose. So I don't think human beings are getting better. I think together we're making the world a better place in some ways. But then again, you know, some people might say, well, it's quite obviously we're not progressing because climate change is destroying the world. And, you know, and other people will say, oh, that's bollocks. It's when I make the claim that we don't seem to be progressing, we don't seem to be able to progress so that individuals are better. Now, of course, there are some Oxford philosophers, one Australian, who say we need to genetically enhance human beings so that they don't have fits of rage or antisocial tendencies. We won't go down that track now. But the second part, how do you reconcile with the evolution of parenting childhood? Well, I guess I'd just say, has there been an evolution in parenting childhood? Clearly, I guess the person who's asking the question thinks there has been, and they would offer some evidence for that. I would offer other questionable claims about parenting and childhood. Let me be frank, and again, I will get shot down. The current trend to parenting and childhood, in Australia anyway, is for parents to have two more than full-time jobs. The trend in some circles is for parents to have two more than full-time jobs and to send their kids to childcare from months of age for other people to parent them, and we pay them to parent our kids. I don't think that's an evolution. I think that's a bad thing. Now, I'm not saying, I've made a blanket claim that it's a bad thing, but hear me clearly, I'm not saying mums have to stay at home full time and dads go out to work and mums bring up the kids full time. I'm not saying that. That is a historical, I don't think there's anything wrong with that if a couple decide to do it that way, or vice versa, or co-parenting, or, you know, whatever else it is. I'm just saying the assumption that it's an evolution to put our kids in childcare 6, 8, 10, 12 hours a day and pay somebody else to bring up our kids. I don't think that's the best thing for kids. I don't think it's an evolution in parenting and childhood. But if this goes public and this gets sent to a lot of people I know, I will be in trouble, because some of the people I know and love think that that is the way forward because, well, everybody else is doing it, which is a pretty bad reason for doing anything.
Absolutely. And
now
fun
I'm in
fact,
trouble.
there's actually like a number of studies that show homeschooling has a significantly better impact on the psychological health of kids everywhere in the world. So it is
Yeah.
true that homeschooling, if an option financially, would be better psychologically for kids everywhere if we could do it, for sure.
Gee, it's hard work though. I mean, as I say, we lived in Argentina for 13 years and a lot of that time was homeschooling. Our kids went to local Spanish speaking schools. But as they got older, they had to do the Australian curriculum because we were going to come back for the final years of school and university. We did homeschooling then. And in fact, our first son here in Melbourne, before we'd gone overseas, our first son at 7 years old was having trouble at school. And we did the whole rethink, which is much more common in the States than Australia. We did the whole rethink and said, why do we think that dropping him into this controlled environment with a bunch of people his own age is the best thing for him? And we pulled him out of school then. And so homeschooling can be great. But gee, it's hard work for whoever does the homeschooling. It's much easier to send your kids to school, and it's much easier to send them to childcare. Parenting is bloody hard work.
Sure. But I would point out that if we are only looking at the past, say, 200 years or 100 years, then that may be a valid argument to say that we've regressed because there's less homeschooling, and so the productivity of raising children has gone down to some extent. But if we look in the past 10,000 years, it's significantly better. There's significant progress.
Well, I mean, and again, some people would push back and say, well, hold on. We're working on a premise. We're working on a premise of this concept of childhood. This concept of childhood is actually a relatively new concept. But anyway, yes, whatever. I'm just saying I'm not sure about the evolution of parenting childhood lately, but I'm not denying that it's much better than having kids working in mines.
Yes,
yeah.
Builds character. You got to send the kids to the mines. Fine.
Well, yeah, I sent my kids to play in trees and perhaps fall and break their arms. I think that sort of thing builds character. Other people say, no, don't climb a tree. You might break your arm. Yeah.
Well, we have been going for about 2 hours. One last question, and then let you go. What are all the attributes of omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, etc. part of? What are those attributes connected to if God is immaterial and timeless?
Yeah, that's good. That's a profound ontological question. If we want to say, here is a God, and now we're going to add an attribute of omniscience and another one of omnibenevolence and immateriality and eternity and all those sort of things, then that implies that you can have this object that you add these attributes to. Dare I appeal to the Nazi philosopher Martin Heidegger, who said our whole way of thinking in the Western world and Western philosophy, analytic philosophy particularly, has been conditioned by this idea that you can have something and separate it from its attributes. And the common example when talking about Heidegger is, what is a hammer? Our scientific Western mindset says, well, if you want to know what a hammer is, you take it out of its context and you examine the object, when in fact, Heidegger says, if you take a hammer out of the context of nails, carpenters, construction practices, you no longer have a hammer. A hammer can only be described as a hammer in its context. So separating out doesn't do the work. When it comes back to God, Christians at least don't claim that God is something that you can add attributes to. Omniscience is just part of what it means to be God. And ultimately, that at least the classical Christian view is that God is simple. God has to be simple. Simple in the sense of not a conjunction of a whole lot of stuff, because then you can hypothetically separate the stuff. Simple in the sense of just one, and omniscience is one way of describing, and love is one way of describing, etc. Because if God weren't simple, then God could change. And that introduces profound philosophical, theological sort of problems with the idea of a creator God that just is, and how God could possibly change. And then you have other questions that come in, which you're probably thinking already, but I won't go into them now.
Sure. Well, that is our show. Thank you for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation. Would you like to do a shout out to your organization?
I would love to. I would love to. I'll do a shout out to the global cousins. In the United States, the American Scientific Affiliation is one organization that brings together scientists who are Christians. And the other big one in the United States is BioLogos, set up by Francis Collins, the head of the Human Genome Project, because he was very concerned about Christians who were young earth creationists, Christian deniers of science. And so BioLogos was set up to push back against that and say, hey guys, we are full on about science, but we're also full on about Christianity. So they're the ones in the States. And in the UK, there's the Faraday Centre and Christians in Science in the UK. And here in Australia, ISCAST, ISCAST, grew out of the Research Scientists Christian Fellowship. And we've been around about 40 years. We do the same sorts of things in Australia that they do in the UK and the States. And we're all cousins and we all sort of talk to each other, even though Francis Collins will not visit Australia because he keeps getting new jobs. We thought when he'd finished the Human Genome Project, he would come. Then he took over the National Institutes of Health, and he said, no, I'm not retired yet. And he finished that, and I wrote to him and said, what about it? No. Joe Biden's asked me to be his science advisor, and he's not doing that now, but he's still doing something for Joe Biden. So I don't think we're ever going to get Francis Collins out in Australia, but there you go. So it's been great to talk to you, Tom. I hope that it's been a fruitful conversation and at least helping people to think. As always, just glancing at the chat, a lot of people feel pretty cranky about Christians, and of course, they might be the ones who are more prone to write in the chat. But I'm sure there's lots of people having a bit of a think, so that's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. It was a great conversation, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your night.
Thank you. Except that it's 9 o'clock in the morning here, so the day is in front of me. Great to talk to you, Tom.
Talk to you later.
Question: does this get posted anywhere, or is it just live?
Yes. So it stays posted. So it gets saved to my YouTube channel. So it's on both of my YouTube channels: Twitch, Facebook, Twitter, X.
Yep. Can you just okay? Yeah, I'll be able to.
Would you like me to send you a link? I can.
Yeah, that'd be great. Sure. Yeah,
Will do.
Good to talk to you.
You as well. Talk to you later.